Before listening to this sermon, you should please read Revelation chapter 21 and also Revelation chapter 22 verses 1 to 5. The title of this sermon is What is Going, What is to Come, and So What? What's going? Before I watch any film, I like to know who the film's director is. Say, for example, if the film's director is Quentin Tarantino, I'll avoid watching it. Quentin Tarantino movies always end violently in a pool of blood. If the film's director is Steven Spielberg, I'll consider watching it. I like E.T. And Roger Rabbit, but I'm not so keen on the Poltergeist and Jaws. If the film's director is Walt Disney, then I'll watch it every time. In Revelation chapter 1, God declares himself to be the Alpha and the Omega, the director of history. God was there at the beginning of history, and he's already written the script for the last scene. However, as Revelation takes us through the time between Jesus' ascension back to heaven and his return, we learn that both nature and Satan seem to have been given co-directing roles. Throughout Revelation, we witness scenes of famine, disease, and dramatic changes in the natural world. Scenes the newspapers would report as being directed by the forces of nature. Throughout Revelation, we witness scenes of violence, deceit, idolatry, and immorality. Scenes directed by Satan, the devil. And though we may have a choice to avoid films that feature these kinds of things, Revelation is preparing us for what we can expect, things that we cannot avoid. In the time prior to Jesus' second coming, Satan's influence will rise, and dramatic changes in nature will increase in frequency, leading to much suffering, persecution, and death. 21 chapters of Revelation have been spent explaining these things, and in every chapter of your life, such things will have and will continue to affect you in some way. But as we read the last chapter of Revelation, we read of some very good news indeed. John, giving a picture of the future when after Christ comes again, writes, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea." In Revelation chapters 12 and 13, the sea is pictured as the door through which evil enters. For in chapter 13, verse 1, we hear of the beast rising out of the sea. In Genesis chapter 3, we hear of the curse being put on God's good creation, a curse that has come because of human sin. This curse has meant that our earthly lives are continuously characterized by pain, difficulty, and death. Natural evil and satanic evil are part and parcel of our daily experience. So it is very good news to hear in verse 1 of chapter 21, it is very good news to hear that one day these things will be no more. We read of the first heaven and the first earth passing away. This includes the curse that has infected the earth as well. We read that there is no longer any sea, which means Satan and evil no longer have any access to wreak havoc in our lives. In this vision of the future, the last chapter of history is described for us, and God, only God, is directing it. The last chapter of Revelation paints a picture of the last chapter in a Christian's life, and the fact that God is the only director is very good news indeed. You know, if Disney wrote the first part of a movie and Quentin Tarantino directed the end, I wouldn't watch it. You could be quite certain that all the happy characters that Disney introduced in the beginning would end up dead. Quentin Tarantino, the violent director, would finish them off. If Quentin Tarantino directed the first chapter of a movie and then Disney directed the end, well, I could just about bear watching it. For no matter what terrors occurred in the first few scenes, I'd be certain that Disney would put all of them right in the end. In verse 4 we read of God putting right all the wrongs in the world, God wiping away every tear from his people's eyes, God doing away with death, mourning, crying, and pain. In verse 5 we hear God declare himself to be the director of all that takes place. There is no co-director in this last chapter. Only God is involved. Verse 5, he who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. Revelation chapter 21 reveals to us what Christians have to look forward to. One day things like death, pain, suffering, and trauma will be gone. This is the information that we're to take to heart, and this is the application that we're to take home. God will be true to his promise and faithful to his word. Our job is to keep clinging on to these promises at all times. Verse 7. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. If you or I were to buy a book titled Victorious Christian Living, it might contain a prayer to pray by which all your problems will evaporate. It might contain a magic bullet type solution by which you'll be changed from weak to strong. A book called Victorious Christian Living might contain pictures of Christians walking down the yellow brick road of life, singing and with smiles on their faces. However, Revelation paints a very different picture of what victory looks like. Revelation shows it that victory in the Christian life looks very differently indeed. In Revelation, Christians are pictured crying out in desperation and asking God, how long? Christians are pictured identifying themselves with the Lamb who was targeted and killed. Christians are pictured with war sounds, battle scars, and battling thoughts related to giving up and to giving in. In Revelation, Christians are pictured this way, and yet they conquer such thoughts, such doubts, such questions, such difficulty. They conquer such things through God's promise and a willingness to cling on. So what about you? How do you face scenes of repeated difficulty that appear in your life every morning? What comfort do you look to when you experience death or mourning firsthand? When the news is only bad, what hope do you cling on to? I'm not asking what you should do, but what do you do? Let's all be honest, such things cause us to despair and sometimes question God to varying degrees. Though it's fine and okay to ask questions and to feel sad about these kind of things, we'll never survive as a Christian unless we bring God's promises to mind. We need to remind ourselves that one day such things will be gone forever. So remind yourself of that, and you'll be comforted to a good degree in your suffering, and your faith will survive. So that's what's going. What's to come? What's to come? Now, depending on your age, you've either seen scenes or been part of scenes in which young children experienced oranges and bananas for the first time. It was due to problems with importing fruit during the war. Children had heard about bananas, but not seen them. They knew bananas existed, but they had not experienced them for themselves. For this reason, the scenes of joy and celebration when war children tasted their first banana, well, those scenes have become very famous indeed. And yet, to get through a war, you have to have more than bananas as a motivation. For though the knowledge of a spouse or mother or loved one, though the knowledge of them back home might keep soldiers fighting, even though thoughts about another person might keep a soldier fighting during a war, nobody dies on the front line for fruit. Throughout the book of Revelation, Christians are pictured as being part of World War III, a war with Satan who tempts and deceives them, battling our own bias towards sin and belief, fighting to keep faith and remain faithful. Christians are part of a war, and the only way you or I are going to be willing to keep fighting is if we have something glorious to look forward to in the end. Revelation 21 is abundantly clear that the thing Christians have to look forward to is a relationship with God Himself. In verse 2, God's people are pictured as a bride, and God is described as the husband. In verse 7, God's people are described as sons and daughters, with God as their perfect Father. In verse 21 onwards, the relationship between God and His people is described as being taken to the next level. From hearing about God to seeing Him face to face. From knowing of His goodness to experiencing His goodness firsthand. Moving from a factual knowledge that we are dearly loved children to having God imprint His name on our foreheads. Moving from comforting thoughts about God to having God actually wipe away every tear from our eyes. From verse 22 onwards, the relationship between God and His people is described as being taken to the next level. You know, the difference between hearing about bananas and tasting one is massive. And the difference between knowing God now and experiencing Him in the future is even greater. So, even if your experience of God now feels superficial, perhaps minimal, remember that in the future, this relationship will be taken to a whole different level. To such a great level that God's people will never be able to shut up about how great it is. You know, we all know that the joy of oranges didn't last very long at the end of World War II. After a week of eating them for breakfast, lunch and tea, people soon got bored. If you send an orange to your grandchildren for Christmas, they'll only thank you out of politeness. And if you give an orange to a teenager today, they'll only grunt. You know, at the end of the war, after a week of eating oranges, people soon got bored. But after Christians leave World War III behind them, they are described as praising God forever and ever. I'll read some verses from chapter 7, verse 9. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes, and they were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." All the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the 4 living creatures. They fell down on their faces before the throne and worshipped God. They worshipped God, saying, "Amen. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen." You know, so often we picture heaven as containing everything that we want, containing ice cream, sunny beaches, ski slopes, roller coasters, music, or whatever else takes our fancy. However, when God gives us a picture of heaven, He doesn't ask us to picture and imagine everything we want. God gives us a vision of the thing we should want most of all. A God who loves us, a Father who cares for us, a God whose commitment to us caused his son to die, a God whose might and wisdom created the universe, a God who shows grace to those whose only contribution to this universe has been sin. It's for these reasons, God's love, God's care, God's commitment, God's wisdom, God's amazing grace. It's for these reasons that God will be loved, marveled, and praised forever and ever. God's information to us, this is what is to come. God's application to us, or so what? What does this mean in the here and now? Well, the application of these verses both involves comfort and challenge. Firstly, comfort. In verse 4 of chapter 21, God is described as the great comforter who wipes away all tears. In chapter 2, verse 2, God is pictured as being the source of abundant healing. To wipe away all tears, God must have a supply of very absorbent tissues. To heal all wounds, God must have a very large first aid kit. To deal with all the pain, sadness, and wounds that have been experienced and are experienced in this life now, God must possess something very big to deal with them all. Now it may be hard to see how the glory of what is to come is so big that all of life's pains will seem minimal. And it doesn't mean that they'll feel minimal now, or that they don't matter, or that God doesn't care. But God does promise that one day we'll be able to look back on all of these things and wholeheartedly agree with the Apostle Paul. Apostle Paul writes, describes his suffering, says, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Information, what is to come is gloriously and big. Application, focus on it. Focus on it in life's big hurts, in the here and in the now. As Paul wrote in the book of Corinthians, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes, not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Application, comfort. That's application number 1. Application number 2, challenge. Revelation 21 is a call to faith and a call to faithfulness. Firstly, a call to faith for the unbelieving. Verse 5, he who is seated on the throne said to me, that's John, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. God is willing to allow anyone to be part of this glorious future. All you need to do is accept. You cannot earn it. You have to accept it as God's gift to you for free. Though it cost God the life of his one and only Son, God is willing to offer you the grace of his forgiveness and the gift of a relationship with him, a relationship that begins now and goes on forever. If you're not a believer, Revelation is a call to put your faith in Jesus today. If you are a believer, Revelation 21 is a call to remain faithful to Christ in the present. To 21, verses 6 to 7. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexual immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulphur. This is the second death. Verse 7 isn't a list of unforgivable sins. Verse 7 is a call to not give up. For the temptation to give up comes to the Christian in various ways. As a Christian, if you are a Christian, you will be constantly tempted to move from standing up for your faith to cowardly standing down. You'll be tempted to move from belief to unbelief, to move from purity to immorality, to move from being the victim to joining the other side. You'll be tempted to move from worshipping God to worshipping idols. You'll be tempted to move from trusting God to looking to something else for security and strength. You'll be tempted to move from truth to lies. You know, at various points in life, if you're a Christian, you'll be faced with these temptations. Sometimes you'll be faced with one, other times many. Sometimes there'll be passing thoughts, sometimes there'll be thoughts that don't go away. It's for this reason Revelation 21 has been given to us, to motivate us to faithfulness and to keep us from giving up. Remember, all difficulty is on its way out. You only need to keep going a little longer. All that is good is to come. God is worth keeping faith for. You need to remember that all our thoughts should keep this end in mind, helping us to stay faithful to Christ in the present.